Chapter 5. Death on the Horizon. Good, because I was about to suggest you look into therapy. The thought process going through Mr. Spector's brain before saying this sounded much like radio static. It seemed like a good idea at the time to test out what sort of magic this kid is using to do all of this. Wild magic doesn't typically manifest as necrotic unless there is a third party involved. However, watching Anthony's irises disappear in a swirl of black and gray smoke, the static in the radio cleared up enough to scream in his mind, "What the hell did you say that for?" Spector was worried for his own safety for quite reasonable reasons. He was either in incredible danger or perfectly safe. The tricky thing is the nature of Anthony's magic might prevent him from being affected by Fey promises. Then again, Spector never actually confirmed for himself if it was wild magic. Anthony could have just agreed to go along with it to hide something potentially more sinister. While Anthony was getting more upset, Spector looked towards Dennis, who looked scared for his life. "It might be an excellent time to leave now, darling. Things are going to get quite spicy." The butler did not need to be told twice, and quickly departed, seemingly heading somewhere with a purpose. "Now, Anthony, I need you to understand that—" "Shut up!" Anthony's voice boomed so loud it must have been magically amplified by pure will, not even knowing he was doing it. The room warped and the floor cracked from the overflowing magic emitting from Anthony. Spector felt a deep dread set in as he realized his means of defense are quite limited. He is out of magic items, and his trusty boomerang doesn't really work well indoors, so all he could do is brandish his knife, something that does such a small amount of damage he would be better off just running. Spector decided to stick to his guns and double down. Anthony stood, glaring at Spector with a stare so intense it very genuinely could kill. Before either of them could start to speak, however, the door flew open as Dennis came in with what smelled like fresh food. Anthony twisted his head so quickly it almost looked like it was being snapped, as he spoke with what seemed like an echo. "What do you want? Weren't you told to leave?" "I do not take orders from anyone except Margaret, young master. I am here to make sure everything goes as smoothly as possible. You seemed upset, so I brought you your favorite snack. Perhaps while you eat, I could direct the inspector to his room. It is getting quite late, after all." Before Spector could understand what was happening, his arm was grabbed and he was quickly brought out of the room. Anthony took the bowl of tomato soup and sat cross-legged to eat it, seemingly fully calmed by the smell of his favorite meal. Dennis dragged Spector into the hall and very quickly started to look incredibly stressed. "Come with me, sir, please." Considering Spector's last plan could have easily ended with him dying, he was all ears right now. Honestly, he needed sleep more than anything else, though he was very confused as to why the young man's favorite meal was tomato soup. That was his grandfather's favorite meal. Maybe it just runs in the family. Dennis brought Spector to a door Spector hadn't seen in decades. "I will not be staying in his grandfather's room. I'm sorry to be picky, but that man was a monster." After taking a moment to gather himself, Dennis started to speak. "This is the young master's room. It has been Anthony's room since he was born. I was hoping you'd be able to take a look around. I take it you've been in this house before? Obviously quite a long time ago." Spector sighed very heavily, and after a minute had an idea. "Dennis, I need you to do me a favor. I'm going to ask you a question. I need you to answer me truthfully. Do the Briars have any pixie dust?" Dennis narrowed his eyes. "Well, that is an illegal drug on this plane. Are you seriously asking the most trusted employee if they have an extremely illegal substance that could get them hunted by the FBI or the Pixie Police? As if I would willingly endanger them by disclosing that kind of information to an investigator." Inspector Spector flew up to the eye level of Dennis and spoke in increasing intensity. "A few things, Dennis. Firstly, I'm not a cop. If I see a crime that I'm not paid to care about, guess what? I don't care about it. Secondly, I am a fae, outside of the Feywild, so that drug does a lot more for me than let me see spirits and piss off the Archfey. Thirdly, I have been awake for several days and I am running on fumes and spite. Now, if you have any pixie dust, I need it. Not because I'm going to snitch, but because I'm going to need to do a lot of it if I want to survive this accursed night in this damned house. Dennis did not say anything for a few moments. Seconds felt like minutes, as Spector's grasp on consciousness was rapidly declining. Firstly, Dennis opened the door to Anthony's room and took out a small blue box decorated with sapphires and made with gold. Inside was enough pixie dust to kill a gnome, an entire ounce of pixie dust. This was the good stuff. Spector could tell due to its shimmer. Spector straightened his incorrectly tied tie and went to work. Chapter 6. 0 Days Sober. Inspector Spector's eyes flashed 1,000 colors before finally setting on his usual vibrant violet. Suddenly, he was very awake, bursting with magical energy and able to see weak spirits near him, and able to sense stronger ones without directly seeing them. In addition, he realized a few things immediately, now that his brain functions have returned back to a semi-normal state. Oh boy, yeah. Dennis watched in mild horror as the amount of pixie dust Spector did would kill a gnome and hospitalize a human. But here stands Spector, having just inhaled an absurd amount of drugs, yet seeming fine. This isn't your first time, clearly, was all Dennis was able to say while watching Spector's mind race at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Spector gathered himself for a moment and reached into his pocket. He took out a sobriety coin and flipped it to Dennis. Everything comes to an end, and if I don't figure out what is happening here very quickly, my sobriety won't be the only thing that dies tonight. He let his words hang in the air for a moment as his mind chased a single thread that he realized had been there this entire time. Tell me, Dennis, how familiar are you with the original patriarch of the house? From what my father told me, he was a troubled old man who was murdered in cold blood when what he needed was help. And if I'm remembering correctly, Mr. Spector, you and that boomerang of yours did the deed. I hope you know I'm not going to let you repeat that with the young master. Dennis, my boy, the only part of that story that was correct was the fact that he was old and I killed him. Calvin Briar was a monster, a detestable old man who had lived as long as he had by absorbing the youth from children who lived nearby, causing many children to inexplicably die of old age. He hired me to investigate some wild goose chase. He had constructed a purposely convoluted mystery just to stress me out. I had my wife with me at the time, and as I tried to solve his impossible riddle, he killed my wife. I regret to say that I didn't notice right away, as he started using dark magics to puppeteer her. When I finally realized what had happened, he made me fight the corpse of my beloved wife. So yes, Dennis, I killed him, and if given another chance, I'd probably kill him slower. Dennis stood there in stunned silence. Dennis himself was a married man, and he could not imagine what he would do to someone if they had done that to his dear Lygra. He trembled at the mere thought of it. I am very sorry for the detestable actions of Calvin Briar, but I fail to see how this is relevant to what's happening here with the young master. I don't blame you, Dennis. I wouldn't have thought it relevant myself about 30 minutes ago, but that was before I broke my sobriety streak. And let me tell you, Dennis, that story does a lot more than expand your view on what the Briars are capable of covering up. Remember how I mentioned how Calvin dabbled in dark magic? Well, he was actually quite well versed in certain aspects of it. Necromancy was his forte, but he had also started working in spirit shackling, a wildly dangerous practice that involves summoning spirits and ghosts and shackling them to your soul. The result of this was very different to what he might have thought it was. Firstly, the only spirits who respond to a beckoning like this are typically dark spirits with heavily negative energy. Secondly, when you shackle them to your soul, it can let them shape it, corrupting your inner self. This means a few things, but what is important is only a few people have tried this, and only one lived to be able to tell the tale. A powerful lich who sought immortality in worship. Calvin was only seeking immortality, but what he got was a permanent, restless spirit. When he died, his soul stayed in this damned house. Now, if you were to guess, Dennis, in which room do you think he rested in? Dennis did not take long to realize what Spector was implying. His face clearly showed the wave of fear and panic as Spector continued to speak. How long has he been demonstrating strange magical abilities? About 4 years. They've slowly gotten stronger, and he has been in less control of them as time has gone on. How long has he been using pixie dust? Dennis took a moment to respond, not because he did not know the answer, but because he started to put things together. About 4 years as well, sir. Spector smiled. Just one last question for you, big guy. Do you have any salt? Dennis answered immediately with a confused look on his face. Yes, we do. Oh yeah. It's all coming together, Spector thought to himself as they both headed to the kitchen. Margaret and Mango raced towards the estate. Margaret running as fast as her brittle bones would allow her, and Mango keeping pace, as he didn't want to show her up and run past her. Something was still bothering him, though, and since they still had a few minutes of running to kill, he decided now was a good time to ask. Margaret, I hope you know that unless Spector is already dead from whatever your son has going on, you'll most likely find him in combat when we arrive. With what you told me about your son and his short fuse this morning, it will most likely be him that attacks first. Get to the point, Mango! Margaret spat out through heavy breaths. She was clearly trying to hurry, but age had not graced her with good stamina. I'm saying that unlike last time, if Spector kills your boy tonight, it will most likely be in self-defense. I will not be able to have him arrested. I just need you to be prepared for that. Margaret looked at Detective Mango with more hatred and contempt than he had ever seen from anyone before in his entire life. If that filthy Silverblood lays a finger on my boy, you are the one who needs to be prepared, Mango. There will be a second murder to cover up. Mango started to speed up, running much faster than he was before, not caring about leaving Margaret behind anymore. Now he was desperately worried that being even a minute late would result in an unavoidable death. One way or another, he knew that there was a death on the horizon. He just hoped it was one he could prevent. Alternatively, at the very least, one he could live with. Chapter 7. Amoral Allies. Dennis and Spector stood right outside the door to the multi-dimensional observation deck. Dennis had a bag of salt, while Spector had some in his pocket as an emergency. Dennis looked very conflicted about this whole thing. Spector noticed the reluctance in his movements. Hey, big guy, what's up? We're walking into a very dangerous situation here. If our theory is correct, then there is a non-zero chance that we don't walk out of here alive. I need you on board, buddy. Dennis can't believe the man he was speaking to was the same man his father told him about. Beware the four-winged devil, young man, his father used to tell him. That little demon will rain havoc and hell upon you before you could finish hanging his coat up. Dennis looked at the small man before him, about to risk his life to save the grandson of the man who murdered his wife. A truly honorable man, despite his flaws. I just want to make sure this whole thing won't kill him. Didn't you say that if Anthony attacked you, he would die? And how do we know if the soul... Spector smiled and brushed his hair back as it was starting to get in his eyes. That's just the thing. If Anthony attacks me, he will die. However, if I get attacked and he lives, then that means it is a possession and Calvin is the one pulling the strings. The salt trick is something I picked up a couple of years ago. Turns out, salt cures a lot more things than meat. God, I'm hilarious when I'm high. Spector started to open the door when he heard the front door of the mansion slam open. After a moment, Detective Mango was face to face with Inspector Spector. Spector, wait. Please let me go in and arrest the boy. Don't do whatever it is you're doing. Despite knowing Mango for years, Spector never really understood the man. Would you care to know what I'm doing before you tell me to stop? A sigh escaped Mango. Unable to discern if it was from defeat or exhaustion, he gestured for Spector to continue. The boy in question is in dire need of an exorcism. I'm a little rusty, but I think I can get the job done. He is being possessed by his detestable grandfather. Obviously, I need concrete evidence, and I plan to collect it before performing the exorcism. If you'd like to help, I already have a smashing plan that will result in a banished spirit, a freshly traumatized but otherwise unharmed kid, and a solved murder case where the murderer has been dead for years. See, this is why I hate working with you, Spector. It's never normal, it's always insane, and yet despite it all, you're always correct. Detective Mango looked closer at Spector and noticed some pixie dust on the Spector's nose. Have you been using again? Come on, man. You promised you'd stay clean. You know I can't turn a blind eye every time. Spector groaned in annoyance. Mango, can we focus on one issue at a time here, please? By the 9 realms, I swear, you always find an opportunity to pick apart whatever I'm doing. Spector knew this was not true. He knew that what Mango said was true, and he needed to deal with the fact that he started using again. If Mango were a fae, Spector would be dead for his broken promise. Though he might die anyways if he starts getting back to pixie dust as much as he used to. I'm sorry, Mango. I swear it was an emergency. I wouldn't be cognizant without it otherwise. At this rate, Mango would fire himself for all the crimes he's had to overlook in just the last 6 weeks alone. But if it wasn't for him, someone else would be getting threatened by the Briars. He couldn't do that to someone else. Let's just save this little turd. What do you need me to do? Anthony felt cold and alone. He watched as he moved in ways he did not understand. He had been crying, as it had never gotten this bad before. His grandpa had promised to help him understand these magical abilities. Grandpa even said that he would help Anthony with a ton of other stuff. All he needed to do was let him in. But ever since then, it's been getting worse. Blackouts, unstable emotions, and even more unstable powers. He stared at his brother's corpse, desperately wanting him to come back. Mark always understood. Mark always knew what to say to make him feel better. He was just trying to help. Anthony crawled over to his brother's body and began to cry, his tears hitting the day-old corpse. I can bring him back, you know, said a chilling voice from behind Anthony's head, a cold breath hitting the back of his neck. Go away, Grandpa. This is all your fault. I should have never listened to you when you said to kill him. I was just so scared they'd send me to Agatha's.
My dear boy, I had nothing to do with his death. Perhaps the stress of everything has you remembering things all wrong. Remember when you thought I had killed your dog? But I did not do that. You did. I just helped you cover it up. I can help you again here, my dear boy. Just let Grandpa help. You know you want to.
Anthony cried harder, as he didn't know what to believe. His memory was so foggy nowadays. He almost felt like he was about to black out, but never quite doing it. Maybe Grandpa was telling the truth? It couldn't hurt to trust him again. Maybe he can fix things like he promised. Okay, Grandpa. Tell me what to do. After a few minutes of careful magic being focused into the body, the fingers began to twitch. Anthony was so happy to see Mark move again. Calvin, was so happy to have a second puppet. Chapter 8. A touching reunion. Mark rose from the ground, his jaw mildly ajar. He moved slowly as rigor mortis had already begun to set in.
Hey, bro.
He spoke in his grandfather's voice for a moment before falling into an eerie facsimile of what his brother once sounded like. But Anthony didn't notice. He was so happy to see his brother back, but the instant he got up to hug him, the door swung open. In an instant, Anthony felt such an intense amount of negative emotions it almost blinded him. Anger, grief, stress, hatred, and strife all swirled within him in an instant, and he screamed loud enough to crack the glass dome in the multi-dimensional observation deck. "Get away from us!" he and Kelvin shouted in unison. The angrier he got, the more their souls melded together. Spector and the gang would have to act quickly, or else Kelvin could fully take over Anthony's body. At that point, the damage would be irreversible, and the only cure would be death. Kelvin gazed at Spector with contempt and hatred never known by the living. Anthony did not know what to do with this intense buildup of rage that wasn't fully his own, and lashed out. Normally, when in a conflict, Dennis would rely entirely on the speech training his father gave him. However, given the situation, it would seem that the lessons of his mother would be more fitting. Dennis goes into a rage like never before, deeply angered that some malevolent spirit would dare to hurt the young master. And even worse, the spirit was Anthony's own grandfather. Dennis knows that the plan is to throw salt at Anthony, but given the emotion of the room and seeing Mark's body start to rise with an unholy glow about him, Dennis could not think straight. Dipping his fist into the bag of salt, he runs over and punches Anthony as hard as he can, hoping either to knock the spirit out of him, or at the very least to knock him out. The salt did a number on Kelvin, and the fist does a number on Anthony. Dennis screams in rage, "You dare defile the bodies of both your grandchildren?" Kelvin jerks Anthony's body backwards from both the blow and the statement, and immediately fires a powerful spell at Dennis in response. Kelvin both sees him as the biggest threat in the room, but also a tool. If Dennis dies by Anthony's hands, even if Kelvin fired the shot, he would be flung into such a deep despair his body would basically be forfeit. A yellow blast shot through the room, deatomizing every single particle in the air before bursting into Dennis's chest. He managed to absorb the blast, but his shirt did not. Should he be hit by another, he would not survive. Kelvin looked through Dennis and all his blind rage and spoke to the terrified man hiding within him. "Do you think yourself righteous? Are you loved by those you strive to protect?" Spector knew that only salt or magic would actually hurt his target. Thankfully, with the pixie dust still raging through him, he could see the silhouette of Kelvin. The downside is, while Spector had a magic weapon, it would make him an instant target. With him is the bound boomerang of bleeding, and while it is very good for a boomerang, it is also the very weapon used to kill Kelvin the first time. Bringing it out would surely put a target on Spector's back, and while he is scrappy, he cannot survive as many attacks as Dennis might theoretically be able to. Regardless of the risk, Spector refuses to be idle, and he will not sit still while his new acquaintance and Mango get hurt. In one fluid motion, Spector throws his trusty weapon at Kelvin, hoping more than anything it does the trick like last time. To Spector's absolute dismay, Anthony catches the boomerang with ease. He cackles out in a voice not his own.
Did you think I wouldn't be ready for you? Did you really think that I have not been prepping every damned day for when I get to see your disgusting self again? Did you think that you, a butler, and some cop would be able to stop 70 years of careful planning and deal-making with a fistful of salt and spunk?
Mango didn't really have a solid idea of how he was supposed to help with the exorcism, and was mildly happy that a fight broke out. This is mostly because, while he may be woefully inexperienced in the realm of the supernatural, killing things that ought to die is like 25% of his job. Knife throwing is one of his key skills, and by the gods is he gonna throw some knives. Picking a target is the tricky part. Obviously, it would be funny to throw a knife at Spector, but this probably isn't the best time to test his reflexes. That leaves 2 actual enemies, and considering they only had a plan for Anthony and his possessed ass, Mango decided to deal with the other one. He is still on the clock, so everyone he kills means more paperwork. But Mark is already dead, so killing him a second time is way less paperwork. Throwing his 2 knives directly at Mark resulted in 2 things. 1, 2 very successful hits directly in his target, causing significant damage. 2, an extremely angry zombie with an even angrier grandpa spirit, now focused intently on killing Mango. Mark's body moved sluggishly, barely making it 10 feet before stopping in front of Mango. Since Mark is both very dead and doesn't have any innate magic, Calvin is limited to just using his body as a blunt instrument. Fortunately for Calvin, that is all that is needed to strike Mango in retaliation for attacking one of his puppets. Unfortunately for Calvin, however, Mango was extremely agile and would dodge any attacks made by this body absolutely riddled with rigor mortis. Grabbing one of the knives plunged into his chest, Mark's body attempted to stab the great Detective Mango. "You dare use one of my own knives against me?" Mango shouted as he dodged this attack easily. Deep within the ethereal plane was a woman who desperately wanted to reach out to Spector. She tries every night to speak in his dreams, but he can never remember them. She tries every moment of every day to get him to know she is there. She has never left his side. She wants more than anything to give Spector some of her power, but he cannot see her. But now might be her chance. Heartbroken that Spector is back on pixie dust, but due to the amount that he did, it might actually be enough for him to sense her. Maybe, just maybe, he will be able to hear her and accept her gift. Leaning next to him, she whispers one thing. "I'm here, my love." Spector snapped his head up upon hearing this. Tears started to flow down his face upon hearing his wife's voice for the first time in 7 long decades. He had felt a presence with him for so long and never once thought it might have been his wife. Suddenly, he became infused with the magic she had been trying to give him for decades. The tears running down his face lit up with a deep purple magic. This magic traveled through the water of his tears into his eyes, engulfing them in magical energy before bursting from his entire body. He had never been able to use magic before. He had no idea it would manifest the same color as his eyes. The combination of the immense amount of pixie dust running through him and the newfound magical bond between him and his beloved, he was able to see her for the first time in decades. Struggling with a mix of emotions, Spector was barely able to get out one sentence. "You're as beautiful as I remembered." His concentration was broken when the door to the multi-dimensional observation deck was kicked open by a very tired and out-of-breath Margaret. He watched as the vision of his wife faded away and turned to look the old crone in the eyes, nearly forgetting why he was there in the first place. Margaret Breyer was absolutely horrified by what she saw. Detective Mango's knives and her firstborn son Mark, who had somehow risen from the brink of death, her butler on the ground with a magical wound in his chest, and the loathsome Inspector Spector suddenly overflowing with some kind of magic. But worst of all, her baby boy, her dear Anthony, was injured and holding Inspector Spector's damned boomerang. She knew it. The worst of her fears of Inspector Spector had been true. He had tried to kill her son. "Was killing my father not enough for you?" she screamed as she ran to protect her little Anthony. Dennis, knowing that he could very well lose young Anthony, began to fully panic as he saw Margaret approach him. She did not know the danger she was in, and now she was directly in front of Calvin. Looking at Anthony's face, he could read the boy's concern for his mother, but almost immediately Calvin took control back. Having Margaret here really threw a wrench into the plan, and while deep down he knew that he cared for the Bryars much more than they cared for him, he still couldn't live if he let them both die under his watch. Moving as swiftly as he could, Dennis tackled Margaret and attempted to shield her with his body. This was unsuccessful as Margaret immediately started to try and get out from under Dennis, screaming at him, "Get off me, you incompetent oaf! Have you forgotten who owns you? I demand you get off me this instant and kill Spector!" The look of hurt that shot across the face of the once loyal butler was quickly replaced with one of acceptance. Calvin was right. The people he is fighting to protect do not care for him. The instant Margaret said that she owned Dennis, it became clear to him what she thought of him. He wasn't a loyal employee who had been trained to work for her family. He wasn't the person who read her children bedtime stories because she was too busy to make time for her children. No, she viewed him as nothing but a slave. Dennis slowly got up and backed away from Margaret, knowing full well what was likely to happen. A disgusting joy filled Calvin upon seeing this transpire. At first, he had felt fear seeing Spector burst with some form of magical energy. But now it seems the universe has delivered his solution as an act of providence. Surely killing Dennis would hurt Anthony, but killing his own mother? The damage would be irreparable, and Anthony would be lost to the void, forever tumbling within his own subconscious, watching helplessly as Calvin puppeteered his body. He raised his hand to strike down his own daughter. Suddenly, his hand jolted back, messing up the spell and blasting Margaret with only a portion of its full strength. She was very hurt despite this, not having the durability or constitution of her butler, but this restrained spell didn't kill her outright. Fighting back from deep within was Anthony, who desperately tried to claw back some control over his own body. "Don't you hurt my mother!" he screamed as a struggle for control began within the depths of his soul. Spector had a half-completed deal with his magical patron, but it was enough to give him the basics. He did not know any spells, but he knew that he had magic within him, and he channeled it into his hands and let out a blast of purple energy. It manifested into 3 bursts of pure magical force, all blasting into the spectral form of Calvin, greatly loosening his grip on Anthony's body. Spector knew the kid was still in there, fighting as hard as he can against a foe much greater than he is. Everything they can do to distract Calvin from the battle within Anthony's soul is another thing that evens the playing field between the two of them. Spector looked to Mango and shouted, "Don't finish off Mark. That'll return the magic Calvin is using to puppeteer him. Just injure him so it takes more energy for Calvin to control it." Mango may be the head detective, but he was plenty good at following orders. With a couple of quick movements, he had sliced up as much as he could of Mark's body without fully immobilizing it. Then, a quick turn and dodge, he was able to gain some distance between him and Mark. Not so much distance that he might target someone else, but enough that he wouldn't be able to get to him fast enough. Mango was not sure exactly what was happening, but he felt the need to explain as much as he could to Margaret as quickly as possible. Speaking as quickly as he can while he moves around her dead son's body, he shouts, "I swear this is all to prevent your son from going to jail or dying." Mark had been resurrected and was under the control of Calvin, but with Calvin very busy fighting with Anthony, Mark was basically on autopilot. Stumbling towards Mango, he futilely attempted to swing at him with an attack his deceased brain was convinced would be fatal. The slow attack was so easily avoided, saying Mango dodged it would be very generous to Mark. Mango took a step backwards and watched as the attack struck nothing but the air between them. Margaret was close to dying. She wasn't a fighter or magically inclined person. She was just a woman who had been struck with a small amount of a very powerful spell. Though she couldn't cast, she recognized the spell she had been hit with. She had been doing lots of research on magic spells and their effects ever since her son started casting. And she knew without a shadow of a doubt that she was going to die. The spell was Disintegrate, and while it wasn't enough to fully disintegrate her in one blow, it had disintegrated everything where it hit. Unfortunately, it hit her in the gut, and she was now clutching the dust that was once several of her organs. None of them having been fully disintegrated, but the dust and blood started to mix. She knew she only had a few moments to live. A normal mother would feel grief and despair watching her own child try to kill her, but Margaret was smarter than the average person. She knew, based on what happened, that something was taking control of her dear boy, and she knew he was fighting inside and tried to save her. Coughing up blood and dust, Margaret tried to encourage her son, but her words were so quiet only she would hear them. "Mommy loves you, Anthony. I love you so much." Dennis could tell Anthony was struggling from within the control of Calvin. He knew there was something he could do to help, but he didn't want to punch Anthony with another salt-filled fist, especially not in front of his mother. Grabbing a handful of salt, he threw it as hard as he could at Anthony, very surprised with how hard he was able to throw it. The salt worked, too. Calvin screamed from within Anthony, sounding as if he had just been set on fire. Attempting to prevent any more spells from being fired, Dennis grappled Anthony. Shockingly enough, a 7-foot-tall orc was easily able to grapple the very thin 6-foot-tall human. The battle for control within Anthony was brutal. An invisible battle between the two being waged within his soul. Calvin spoke with a chilling voice dripping with menace.
"Come now, my dear boy. Do you really want to throw away all this magic and knowledge? I can save your mother, who is desperately clinging to life because of a spell you fired. Wouldn't you like her to live long enough for you to apologize?"
Well, it seemed like Calvin had the advantage magically. Anthony was able to see the fear in his grandfather due to the constant barrage of attacks on his spirit. "I'm sick of your lies, Grandpa. You have done nothing but hurt people. While you were in my body attacking these innocent people, I was in your mind. I saw the awful things you've done, and I'm not going to let you lay the guilt of your actions at my feet any longer. You killed my dog to make me depend on you. You killed my brother to weaken my spirit. And you tried to kill both Dennis and my mom so I would give in to your will. I'm sick of it, Grandpa, and I want you out." Calvin was struggling to retain his control. Spector's magic and that damned salt was starting to hurt. He needed Anthony to give in now, or he would be forced out of his body. Calvin had put so much of his magic into Anthony to prepare his body for a full possession. If he is evicted from the body now, he would not have enough magical energy left to retain his form.
"Listen to me, boy. Without me, you will have nothing. No brother, no magic, no mother to comfort you. If you kick me out, you will be truly alone. Do you think Dennis will stay employed after the person paying him dies? Especially after you struck him with such a deadly spell? You will be alone, truly alone, with nothing left but your own despair in this empty house. Be reasonable, boy, and let me stay.
His pleas landed on deaf ears, as each word he spoke only made Anthony angrier and angrier. With a great force and burst of magic wholly his own, Anthony forced Calvin out of his body. The spectral form of Calvin desperately needed a host to remain whole, and dived into the only body he could. Only Spector and Anthony could see him dive into the deeply injured body of Mark. Spector pointed to Mark's body to communicate the news to everyone else. Being in a borderline useless body only served one possible purpose. He could play dead and hope no one notices him. Maybe after some time he could get some of his magic back and take control of another child, one with less willpower. This plan of his was forged in desperation and would not work, as Spector, Anthony, Mango, and Dennis stood above him. Spector looked to Anthony and spoke in as gentle a voice as he could. "I'm sorry, but you've got to finish it off. My magic is too new to be reliable, and yours is much more powerful anyways. I really am sorry, but you'll have to kill your brother again." Anthony looked at Spector with tears in his eyes. He was so exhausted. He just wanted this all to be over with. "I didn't kill my brother. My grandpa did. And I'm not about to kill my brother now. I'm going to avenge him." A burst of electricity shot from his hands, completely destroying the body, leaving nothing for Calvin to cling to. As the fading spirit tried to keep itself from disappearing, he started to cry for help. His voice could not be heard by anyone, not even the being he called to. His final thoughts were of the being he spoke to all those decades ago. Maybe if he had asked for help before this fight, things would have turned differently. His regrets faded like vapor as his soul vanished from this realm, almost certainly going straight to the Nine Hells. Chapter 9. A Pyrrhic Resolution. The last thing Margaret saw before she shut her eyes was an explosion of magic leaving Anthony's body as he expelled Calvin. She could not see Calvin, nor did she know enough about magic to recognize what was happening. All she saw was her son in pain, and she shut her eyes, not wanting the last thing she saw to be his death. Importantly, she shut her eyes well before she died, now laying there with her eyes closed, not sure if she even has the stamina to open them again. Suddenly, she feels a hand gently cradle her head, and it causes her to cough. Through sheer force of will, she pries her eyes open. She's close enough to dying that her hearing is almost entirely gone. She gets to see her son one last time before dying. Subconsciously, Margaret smiled, this being her final action before passing away into the ethereal plane for just a moment. She sees a tall sea elf standing over Spector, and she recognizes her as the wife that she was told Spector killed. Only now, upon seeing her standing over him, did she start to doubt the narrative she was fed. The look on the elf's face was not one of scorn or rage. She did not seem to want revenge. What she held within her was boundless love for Spector. It was then that Margaret wished she had gotten to know her name all those years ago. Before she could speak, a tall figure appeared before Margaret. Easily 9 feet tall, this being in front of her wore a black cloak adorned with gold. The gold did not look gaudy, but instead left her with the impression that she was standing before royalty. The figure took off their hood and revealed a jackal head, with an almost kind expression on his face. Margaret, 80, died of major organ failure and blood loss. You are survived by your son, and despite his many traumas, he will lead a long life. You have done what you could, And now it is time for you to pass. Please, let me guide you. The way to your destination is long, and it would be easy to get lost if you do not know the way. Margaret looks upon this being and recognizes him from her studies. She spent many years trying to look into every possible afterlife so she could talk to her father again. She never knew that he was in the house this whole time and just didn't want to speak with her, for she offered him nothing. I know you. Aren't you Anubis, one of the gods of the dead? She was very confused, considering she was led to believe, based on her research, that Orcus was the god of the dead, and he is from an entirely different pantheon. Yes, young one. I guide the willing souls to the gates of the afterlife. Once we get to the gates, I will weigh your heart against the feather, and we will see what afterlife you may go to. Normally I'd have someone else come get you, but we are running low on gods at the moment. I hope my presence does not intimidate you, or sway your choice as to whether you would like a guide or not. Margaret looks to the sea elf standing over Spector. She's been dead much longer than I have. Why hasn't she been brought to the gates? Margaret was trying to stall, as she didn't want to leave just yet, but she also did not want to find her own way to the gates of the afterlife. She is worried that perhaps Spector's wife is trapped here now after saying no to a guide once. Anubis stands up straight and looks back at the sea elf. Serenity has had many chances to come with us to the gates. We check on her once every 10 years. She is here of her own volition. She does not wish to be anywhere else. She is content to be by his side, even though there is no way he can see her without assistance. I wonder how her heart would weigh against the feather. But at this rate, I'll have to wait for Spector to die and weigh them both. Anubis seemed lost in thought for a moment before reaching down and offering his hand. Do you wish to have a guide to the gate? Anthony cradled his mother's head as gently as he could, his tears getting mixed up with the blood and dust on her face. I'm so sorry, Mama. I didn't mean to do it, I swear. I'm so sorry I hurt you, Mama. I didn't mean to hurt Mark either. It was Grandpa. I know that sounds crazy, but it was Grandpa. Dennis walks over to Anthony and hugs him. In my culture, it is believed that when you die, you are told the exact circumstances of your death. It is likely she knows you did not kill her. It was your grandfather. Please do not worry yourself with this burden of guilt. Let us move on to mourning. Anthony sniffles and nods his head. He knows he didn't kill his mom, but it felt like he did. He isn't sure if he'll ever forget the look on her face when the spell hit her. He does his best to swallow his sadness and goes over to his brother, or what's left of him. Hey, Mark. I'm sorry I was such a rotten younger brother. You always tried your best to give me advice, which must not have been easy because you didn't even know what I was going through. But I think you were right. I should probably go to therapy, especially after this. I'm sorry, Calvin told me to take your shoes. He was trying to make me think I killed you. Anthony takes off the shoes and puts them back on Mark's feet. He takes his old shoes and casts a small fire spell, burning them to ash. Spector went over to the young man and patted him on the back. It looks like you're really getting the hang of that magic stuff now that you don't have someone else pulling the reins. You're a good kid, Anthony. If you ever need my help again, I'd be happy to help, okay? Anthony laughs a mirthless laugh. I appreciate this offer, Mr. Spector. People say you're bad luck, but I don't think anyone else could have helped me. When Calvin directed me to your door, I think he wanted revenge and a chance to kill you, but I'm really glad he did because I have my body back again. I only wish I could see my mother again, but I think I've had enough of communicating with the dead for a lifetime. If you need help with anything, just let me know. Anthony walks over to Dennis and gives him a hug. Dennis, you've been good to me. I'm sorry for everything my mother said. If you want to go out on your own, I'll be okay. I'll leave it up to you. But in case you want for anything other than a life of service, I'll sign the papers immediately, freeing you and any sons you might have from the contract my grandfather penned. Calvin. Dennis nods his head and just says, I will consider it, Anthony. Thank you very much. Detective Mango starts filling out a report. I'm not going to interview you guys. I was here to witness it. I'll make sure the police don't hassle you over this either, Anthony. The man who killed your brother and Mark is dead and gone. If they ask for a body, I'll say he disintegrated. I'll leave out the personal details about possession, and I'll do what I can to make this go smoothly. I got a money guy. He can help you piece together things left to you due to Margaret's unfortunate passing. Spector started to head out, realizing he's not needed here anymore. As he flutters through the hallways of this once damned house, he starts to think about his wife. She was there. She was right in front of him. She was able to give him some kind of magic, and she spoke to him. It was only because of the pixie dust he was able to see her. The drug recovery inspiration program is going to be very disappointed in Spector if he ever tells them. Right as he reaches the door, a hand grabs onto Spector's shoulder. Anthony, out of breath, says, Wait! I still have to pay you. He was taking enormous gulps of air in between every other word. Anthony hands Spector 10 gold pieces. Spector notices he's been overpaid immediately. No, hold on. You already paid me 5 gold before we left. You only owe me 5 more, not 10. Spector takes out 5 gold coins and hands them back. Anthony doesn't accept them and pushes the gold back into Spector's hand. Take it, my friend. 5 for solving the case, 5 for freeing me of that detestable old man. If you refuse to take it, I'll simply have to hire you to solve the case of the missing letter opener and pay you 5 gold to find it. Spector, knowing when he was beaten, took the gold and left. He didn't head straight home, however. Instead, he headed to an old friend that he had hoped he wouldn't see again. Several hours later, there was a knock on Spector's door. Dennis is very nervous, knocking on the door just a few hours after seeing him last. He didn't even get to say goodbye. After considering Anthony's proposal, it only took him an hour to want to be something else. He got just a taste of solving a mystery with Spector, and he wanted more. He knocked again, hoping Spector would answer, hoping Spector would hire him to work for him. Hell, with the gold he got from Anthony, he would be willing to work for free for a little bit, just to prove he could be useful. He knocked a 3rd time, getting increasingly anxious about this. Maybe he had the wrong address? Seemed unlikely there would be 2 people named Spector in Omni City, but it didn't seem impossible. Regardless, Dennis wrote a letter explaining the situation and his desire to work for Spector, and put it in the mailbox. Spector would eventually read the letter, but it would take him a few days. Spector lights a flame and melts some pixie dust into a strange-looking silver liquid. Spector drops it into his mouth. It burns, but it's more potent that way. He wants to see his wife. And that was Inspector Spector and the Case of the Deadly Death. Let me know what you thought. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I am so tired, so I'm sorry if my acting wasn't as good as it could be. But just for sticking around, I'll give you guys a sneak peek into the next story. I already have Chapter 1 written, and I'm slowly working on the rest of it. But here it is. Chapter 1 of the sequel. The sequel is called Inspector Spector and the Aquatic Aberration. Chapter 1. It was a damp and soggy night. Olivia hated her job at the Omni City Aquarium. She spent years of her life studying magical marine biology, only to get a janitorial position at an aquarium because she wasn't aquatic enough. There was an unspoken bias amongst the magical marine biology field to favor species that could naturally speak to fish or breathe underwater. Wizards usually get a pass because they can do many of those same things, but with magic. Sometimes druids can get some favor if they're skilled enough to turn into fish. Olivia Knott was just a scientist. She didn't have the knack for magic, and with her being a changeling, she was viewed as habitually deceitful since she could naturally shapeshift. Some rumors spread, and now everyone thinks she shapeshifted into someone named Olivia, who earned the degree, only to kill them and replace them. Obviously, there was no truth to this, but rumors are like tree sap. They're annoying and hard to get off you. Mopping up the muck that accumulates in the floor of the aquarium was her main responsibility. Everything the tourists bring in, and everything the fish people bring in naturally. It was a lonely, miserable, and soul-crushing job. The air was so humid she felt like she was sweating the instant she walked in. The only sounds she could hear were the tanks and the endless squelching of her footsteps against the damp and soggy floor. Tonight, however, she heard something else. After 3 hours of mopping the main area, she moved into the sub-basement, where all the fish that aren't on display were kept. The moment she opened the door, at the bottom of the stairs, she could hear someone else moving in there. The footsteps were unmistakably of rubber on wet stone, though whoever it was, they were trying to be sneaky. She could also hear the rustling of metal things inside a bag. Maybe tools, maybe medical equipment, maybe knives. She knew that if she took a single step on the stone floor, this person would hear her just as clearly as she could hear them. So she closed the door gently and moved on. Whoever that was, it was not her responsibility to stop them. Plus, what's the worst thing they could do? Steal some fish? This place has too many fish anyways. If you can't put them all on display, then get rid of some. Keeping something non-sentient like a goldfish out of sight, that's not a crime. But keeping something like a koatoa down in the basement feels like abuse. They may not be the smartest species, but they are leagues above most fish and have their own language and religion. The fact that they keep trying to preach to the kids isn't a sign to put them in the basement, it's a sign to put them back where you found them. She continued her way past the door, heading to the end of the main hall to put away her mop bucket. Just before the closet she calls an office, one of the mermen was trying to get her attention. She normally ignores him since she can't speak his language, and he is an incessant flirt. But he wasn't trying to flirt this time. He was waving frantically, pointing to the water filter. It had been turned off, and without it, he would eventually die. Olivia thinks to herself, poor thing. Once born in captivity, their lungs can't adapt to anything other than the fresh water we put them in. This is when Olivia realized something. The sub-basement was the only room with access to the water filtration controls. Whoever was in there must have turned off the water filtration system, though Olivia could not think of a single reason why someone would want to. Either way, she had to put a stop to this. Wielding her mop like a spear, she descended the stairs to the sub-basement. This was the last time she was seen alive. Her screams would be roundly ignored by many of the creatures she spent her life studying. Olivia's life would never amount to much. Her life goal of working in the aquarium was met with distrust and a mountain of struggles. Her last thoughts were of her mother, who pleaded with her to do something different with her brilliant mind. Her lifeless corpse was chopped up and tossed into one of the tanks around feeding time. There wasn't much left afterwards. Nothing except her arm. And that was the teaser. A sneak peek. This will not be done for a hot minute, but it will be done next year. At some point in 2024, this will be all done. And if I get this video out in time, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Festivus. Happy holidays. Happy Yule. Whatever it is you celebrate, congrats. Congratulations. And
Au revoir, adieu, and goodbye.